Hello, welcome to Miss Peepers Reading Corner. I'm Katrina, aka Miss Peepers, and this is Baroness T'challa von Schnoodle, and we're here to talk about books. Today we're discussing Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This book, yes, apparently this book smells good. Or maybe she just wants me to pet her. I'll put this here. I stole T'Challa's sleeping spot for the sake of making this video. This is the price of content. Jude the Obscure follows a man named Jude Foley. He grows up in a farming community and makes a connection with his teacher at the school, who moves to nearby Christminster with the intention of going to university there. And as a result of this, Jude also decides that he wants to study at Christminster. But what Jude does not realize as a child and learns as he gets older is that while people tend to be supportive in theory of his learning and education, the truth is that his social class holds him back from a lot of those opportunities, not just the price of it, but also just the ability to get into the school. You need a certain level of education before you can even realistically apply. And so he attempts to educate himself, but as he gets older, he gets a little distracted. Oh my goodness. But as he gets older, he gets a little distracted by a woman who lives nearby. Her name is Arabella, and they get married. And we watch as Jude's life unfolds and he moves further and further away from his childhood dream of education. So social class is a huge theme in this book, but primarily this story is about relationships. We have Jude and Arabella who get married. Their marriage does not go well. And then later, Jude falls in love with his cousin, Sue. And that also could have gone better. And so Jude's relationships with these two women unfolds in very different but similar ways. And Arabella and Sue are certainly foils of one another, and they want different things. They go about getting those things very differently. And Jude, I think, feels stuck in the middle. This book, which was written in the late 1800s, was very shocking for its time, really because of both female characters. Arabella is interested in marrying Jude from the start, and so she makes a plan to convince him that she is pregnant and that he must marry her. And there's only one way to do that. She seduces him and they get married. Sue, on the other hand, doesn't really want a relationship and or a marriage at all. She wants friendships and she wants to live on her own, but she also feels the pull of society saying that she should want to get married to a man, make a family, live happily ever after, and that sort of thing. And so she feels this tug of what she wants for herself and what society says she can have. And that definitely creates a lot of conflict, not only between her and Jude, but also other characters in the story. I'm trying not to spoil the ending or spoil the big events in the story, in case you haven't read it. So this book was really shocking in this idea of there is divorce in this book. There are feminist ideas that to a modern reader don't seem that out there, but at the time were incredibly unusual to hear. And there's also a terrible tragedy that occurs towards the end of the book, so I'm not going to spoil it for you, though I will say there are content warnings that you should definitely be aware of. We'll talk about content warnings in a moment, but there's a terrible tragedy that just rocks Sue and Jude and completely devastates the life that they are trying to build. The way that it happens, I think, was also it was shocking for me as a modern reader. I can only imagine someone 150 years ago reading this and trying to comprehend how such a thing could happen. It's not to be all mysterious, but it's a pretty shocking scene. And so actually after this, and also Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is of course Thomas Hardy's probably most well-known work, he got so much backlash from these stories that he decided, you know what, I'm not writing prose anymore, I'm going back to poetry. And he stuck to that. He stopped, I believe Jude the Obscure was his last published novel. For a Victorian era novel, this is incredibly readable by a modern audience. I think a lot of times when we think about Victorian literature, we're thinking about Charles Dickens, George Eliot, who have, who were excellent writers, don't get me wrong, but their style is very dense and can be difficult to follow. It requires a lot of attention if you're going to read them. And so, and yet Jude the Obscure, and this is my first Thomas Hardy. I haven't actually read Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is, I was thinking about that and kind of surprised, how did I miss that? So I'll have to read it. But I found Thomas Hardy to be incredibly easy to read, easy in the prose. It flows really nicely, and it sounds good to a modern ear, if that makes sense, in a way that some other Victorian authors are just harder to parse through. There are content warnings I want to call out for this book. There are a few scenes with animal death, one in particular that involves the slaughtering of a pig that is described in pretty intense detail. It is relevant to the character development, so I wouldn't call it a gratuitous scene per se, but that one I had a little difficulty with. I had a little bit of difficulty reading. It did not sit well with me, and probably will not for a lot of readers. And then this book also discusses suicide and also the death of children, so just something else to be aware of going in. I don't want to give too much detail on that because that is a spoiler, but if that is a challenging topic for you, please look it up and take care of yourself. That's the most important thing. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. From what I understand, it's not the best Hardy. That Tess of the D'Urbervilles seems to be the favorite amongst folks, so I'm actually pretty excited to read that one at some point. But I thought this was a really good read. One thing that Thomas Hardy was not that great at was dialogue. There are some repetitive scenes, and some of the repetition I think is intentional, in that Jude and Sue and Arabella are kind of caught in this loop throughout their lives. But some of the dialogue did kind of fall flat for me. But as far as a character discussion and a character-driven story, I thought that the characters, even though they were archetypes, were built out pretty well. And while the book is titled Jude the Obscure, it's about Jude ostensibly. Ultimately, his life revolves around these two women, Arabella and Sue. And they're certainly very much opposites in that Arabella is very sensual and very outgoing and very open about what she wants. And Sue, on the other hand, knows what she wants, but she is hesitant to express that, and she is more reserved, both socially and physically. She does not seem particularly interested in sexual relationships or even in romantic relationships, but again, she feels like she should be. So in some ways the character is almost queer-coded in a way, but that's just conjecture, in that she doesn't quite fit into that heteronormative Christian expectation of men and women get married, have children, live their lives together, and she has a really hard time with that. There's also a lot in this book around the education system at that time. It's more background because it's not the core story, but it's Jude's driving force. Whenever Jude loses something, he goes back, or someone, he goes back to trying to study and better himself in that way, and he never quite gets there. So that the book is very much about loss. It's very much about falling into the same traps of the previous generation. And even Jude's aunt recommends that he not, or actually insists that he not, have anything to do with Sue because their parents had really bad relationships. And so bringing them together, she feels, is going to be problematic. It is. She's not wrong, but it's all about repeating the generation's mistakes, the previous generation's mistakes, or carrying the challenges from the previous generations. At one point, Jude learns that realistically, to get to university from where he was born in, the social structure that he was born in, would actually take several generations of wealth building and connections and education and creating success. So he couldn't do it for himself, but he could theoretically set that in motion for his grandchild or great-grandchild. And that there's definitely a tragedy in that he wants one thing throughout this entire book and he can never have it. And he ends up in these romantic relationships that are part distraction, but also part, I think he falls into them in some ways because he knows that that ultimate thing that he wants isn't realistic, but he still wants to go for it. And I think in some ways he's looking for an excuse not to get those things, which in itself is very sad. So it's not an uplifting novel, that's for sure, but I do recommend it. I did enjoy it actually quite a bit, and I'm still even forming my thoughts on this book as I'm talking through it here. So I think there's a lot in there. I would definitely read more Thomas Hardy, and I encourage you to do the same. So let me know what you think. Have you read Jude the Obscure? Did you like it? And either way, I will see you in the next one.